Chapter 1 coming in 3, 2, 1. Chapter 1. A New Appreciation of John Kennedy. A half-century ago, on a cool November evening, an enormous jet landed at an airport near Washington, D.C. and taxied into the harsh glare of Klieg lights. A truck with a hydraulic cargo lift mounted on the back sped across the tarmac to an open door at the rear of the plane. In the doorway, several men in dark suits struggled with the weight of an ornate wooden coffin as they carried it onto the lift and set it down at their feet. Almost immediately, someone threw a switch and the lift began to move down to the tarmac. But after it had gone just a few feet, it stopped and would go no farther, forcing the men in suits to jump down and remove the coffin by hand. They moved quickly, almost frantically, knowing that each moment of delay was an eternity for Jacqueline Kennedy, the bewildered young woman who stood at the edge of the lift, her eyes locked on the coffin. Unobserved, Robert Kennedy had galloped up a boarding ramp and pushed his way through the plane to be with her. Now they stood together on the lift, holding hands as they watched the manic frenzy on the ground below them. The men in suits swarmed around the coffin and pushed it into the rear of an ambulance. Jacqueline Kennedy fell forward into the outstretched arms of a man in military uniform, and he gently lifted her down to the ground. There were dark stains on her skirt and stockings. She walked to the ambulance and tried to open the door. When it would not open, she stepped back, confused, unsure of what to do next. After several uncomfortable seconds, someone unlocked the door from the inside. Jacqueline Kennedy took a seat behind a curtained window, and the ambulance disappeared into the night shadows. Millions of Americans watched this macabre homecoming on black and white televisions. Unheard was their collective gasp the instant the coffin came into view. Unheard was the skipped beat of their hearts when Jacqueline and Robert Kennedy held hands, a small moment of tenderness that, for a fleeting moment, softened the raw grief that was spreading across the nation. Unheard was their muffled cries when they realized the dark stains on Jacqueline Kennedy's clothing were remnants of her husband's destruction. 3 days of elegant solemnity would follow, a tribute from the woman who loved John Fitzgerald Kennedy and sat beside him when he died. But on this night, those who brought him home were engulfed by anguish so raw that it could be endured only if their emotions were temporarily shut down. The friends, aides, and political leaders who came to the airport to show their respect found themselves incapable of speech. A journalist who stood among them would later write, "One wished for a cry, a sob, any human sound to break the desperate silence." Lyndon Baines Johnson and his wife came down a stairway at the head of the plane and walked to a microphone. The new president spoke with little emotion. His words were neither profound nor comforting. He said the nation had suffered a loss that could not be weighed, that the assassination was a deep personal tragedy for him, and that he would do his best, and then he asked the nation and God to help him in the days ahead. It was about him. Not once did he mention the name of the extraordinary leader who moments before had been removed from Air Force One on a cargo lift and hauled away like excess baggage. Nor did he tell us how to deal with the awful questions that were beginning to tear at our guts. For a brief time, the nation had been under the spell of an eloquent, idealistic man who spoke with passion about our history and culture. He challenged us to meet our civic responsibilities and spoke about the joy that comes with the pursuit of excellence. We had come to rely on his ability to make us proud of our country and of ourselves, and now suddenly he was gone. How could something like this happen in the most civilized country on earth? What would become of us without him? Why had he died? Kennedy had himself wrestled with the why of senseless death many times. His brother, a bomber pilot during World War II, had died when his plane exploded. A few years later, his sister died in a plane crash, and he slid into a deep, paralyzing grief, crying for days and endlessly rereading her letters. Men he had come to love died under his command in combat. He stood in stunned silence over the grave of a friend killed during the bloody fighting on Guadalcanal, unable to comprehend why such a good man was destined to meet such a gruesome end. Later, to help others cope with their own times of loss, Kennedy spoke about what grief had taught him. "There is always inequity in life," he said. "Some men are killed in a war. Some men are wounded. Some men never leave the country. It is very hard in military or in personal life to assure complete equality. Life is unfair." And now, on this cool November evening, as the nation began to realize that he was gone forever, the harsh truth of his own words became the only possible explanation for the why of his death. Life is unfair. What should we make of him now, after all this time, this man whose death so devastated this country? A half-century after Dallas, we are still struggling with that question, still coming to terms with John Kennedy, his life and presidency. Did he leave behind enduring gifts or merely a few years of style and glamour? Was he a great president or, as some have argued, a great pretender? The American people have never wavered in their estimation that Kennedy was a great president. In one poll, they ranked him as the second greatest president in history, a few percentage points behind Abraham Lincoln, an astonishing statement of respect. When asked in polls to name the past president they would like to see return to office today, the people have consistently answered overwhelmingly, John Kennedy. The historians, political scientists, and pundits who assess the performance of presidents, however, believe the people love Kennedy because his brutal death broke their hearts. They argue that he was not in office long enough to be considered great. To them, his legacy will forever be what he could have done had he lived. He was a work in progress. In 1968, when he eulogized his slain brother Robert, Ted Kennedy said he need not be idealized in death beyond what he was in life. According to the academics, the people have done exactly that with John Kennedy. They have irrationally elevated him to a status that he does not deserve. James McGregor Burns, a respected historian and Kennedy biographer, questioned the perception that Kennedy was a great president as follows. His actual, tangible, material impact on history was not enough to justify this. After all, he was not a Churchill. He was not a Roosevelt. He didn't have time to be these people. Why did he have this kind of impact on the world? Was it a fabrication? Was it that he was handsome, his wife and kids? Was it civil rights? There is some merit to this view. Only 4 presidents have been considered truly great: Washington, Lincoln, and Theodore and Franklin D. Roosevelt. George Washington led the revolution that created this nation and then set a high standard for future presidents. Abraham Lincoln transcended the presidency, preserving our unique system of democracy with his humanity and eloquence during a gruesome civil war that could have permanently torn the nation in two. Teddy Roosevelt ended years of government-sanctioned corporate greed and made this country a global power. Over a period of 11 years, Franklin Roosevelt, from his wheelchair, led us through the Great Depression and successfully fought a catastrophic world war. Without the towering leadership of these men, the United States would be a vastly different country today. It is indeed irrational to rank Kennedy among these leaders. He was president for just 1,037 days, 103 days shy of a full term. Only 5 presidents in history served less time in office. He did not lead the nation through a prolonged crisis that tested his leadership abilities. He was Washington without the American Revolution, Lincoln without the Civil War, Franklin Roosevelt without the Great Depression or World War II. Why, then, do the people insist year after year that Kennedy was a great president? A researcher who examines attitudes toward the presidency told the author, "I wish I had $1 for every time someone told me that things were never the same after Kennedy died. They cannot explain exactly what changed, but they believe things went downhill after he died, and they miss him. The emotional trauma caused by his death, as the academics contend, is certainly a factor. It is impossible to minimize the anguish the nation endured when Kennedy was murdered. If the shooting in Dealey Plaza occurred today, it would be captured by cell phone cameras and immediately uploaded to the internet. We would be able to watch endless replays until we became numb to the horror. But in 1963, we knew only that Kennedy had been shot in the head by a man using a high-powered rifle. This fate was too violent and hideous to comprehend. Our only recourse was to wrap Kennedy in a blanket of unconditional reverence. The public may also believe that Kennedy was a great president because he possessed qualities often associated with great presidents. He could explain complex issues with the type of soaring eloquence that captivates and motivates people. Having this ability, however, does not automatically elevate a president to greatness. Despite his charm and eloquence, Kennedy had not passed a prolonged test of his leadership. According him the mantle of greatness under traditional standards is impossible. Should we say with finality that ordinary citizens are simply not as objective as historians, that their opinion of Kennedy is based on raw emotion rather than logic? Kennedy was a very good president who simply did not have the time to earn the greatness the people have bestowed on him. Would it be best to just let the matter rest with this assessment? To do so would be a mistake. Kennedy's legacy is not what he could have accomplished if he had had more time. It is instead what he accomplished in the short time he was given. His actual, tangible, material impact on history was enormous. His true legacy is the difference between the type of country he was building during his presidency and the type of country we became after his death. What exactly is this difference? Consider the following. When a president enters the White House, he brings with him the characteristics that will shape his time in office, his genetic inheritance, family background, intelligence, education, and life experiences will determine his view of America and the methods he uses to promote this view. In this regard, Kennedy was unique in our history. His early life was a perfect training ground for the presidency. He was, in fact, a child prodigy. As a boy, he spent countless hours reading about history, government, and world affairs, acquiring an adult's understanding of the very issues a good president should master. At boarding school, he read the New York Times every day. Then he would lie in bed and think about what he had just learned. A Kennedy family friend who visited him in the hospital said, "I found him so surrounded by books I could hardly see him." I was very impressed because at that point, this very young child was reading The World Crisis by Winston Churchill. Kennedy was also no stranger to the brutal side of life. He endured the deaths of loved ones, the horror of war, and unrelenting physical illness and pain. He was rushed to a hospital, clinic, or infirmary, sometimes in a desperate attempt to save his life, 43 times in his 46 years. He received the last rites 3 times. He lived with the expectation that his life would be short. Thus, by the time he reached the White House in 1960, Kennedy had lived through more intense, formative experiences than most people encounter in a lifetime. They endowed him with a sophisticated knowledge of government and a sense of empathy for the suffering of others. As president, he merged these attributes into a single uplifting force that was unlike anything this country had ever seen. His goal was to use government to make our lives worth living during the short time we spend on Earth. Historians tend to overlook the importance of the experiences that shaped John Kennedy. They are, however, the key to understanding what he accomplished as president. He studied government and political theory at Harvard, where he encountered the works of the great political and social philosophers such as Aristotle, Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. One of his professors, Payson S. Wilde, observed that he had the ability to think deeply and in theoretical terms. Then, to supplement his study between 1937 and the outbreak of war in Europe in 1939, he traveled to nearly every continent on the globe, visiting France, England, Germany, Belgium, Italy, the Netherlands, Scotland, Austria, Russia, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland, the Baltic republics, Turkey, Egypt, Palestine, and 8 countries in Central and South America. As he traveled, he probed the minds of both those in high office and ordinary citizens anxious to learn about the politics and economies of each country. It was during this study and travel that he began to develop the principles of government that he would bring to the presidency. He came to believe, for example, that effective political leadership was a matter of intellectual and political courage. He felt that leaders in pre-war Europe had lacked the courage to tell their people the truth about Adolf Hitler's intention to start another war in Europe. Because their leaders had withheld this vital information, Kennedy reasoned the citizens of England and France had been unable to comprehend the urgent need to prepare for war. They changed their views slowly, trapped by what Kennedy called the inertia of human thought. Based on what he had observed, Kennedy concluded that for a free society to survive, to successfully compete, the leaders have to tell the truth. He believed it was the duty of world leaders to urge people to confront reality. Later, during his time in the House and Senate, Kennedy became contemptuous of political leaders who made decisions based on doctrinaire beliefs and ignored their obligation to promote the common good. In his view, political leaders must objectively diagnose problems and offer solutions based on facts, not on a predetermined set of beliefs or an overarching ideology. Thus, Kennedy based his presidency on 3 basic principles, the product of his relentless study and travel. 1. It is the president's responsibility to identify threats to the nation's welfare. 2. It is the president's responsibility to inform the people about these threats truthfully so they are prepared to react to them effectively. 3. It is the president's responsibility to provide the people with facts, not biased information clouded by predetermined beliefs. The purpose of this approach was to prevent the people from becoming uninformed and complacent. To reach this goal, Kennedy deliberately governed as if the nation faced a never-ending series of threats, and he deliberately involved the people in the process of dealing with these threats. In less than 3 years in office, he held more than 60 press conferences. Today, the media often recounts the humor he displayed during these televised meetings. More important, however, is that he used them to treat the people as if they were an essential component of government, elevating them to the status of concerned and involved citizens. He gave them the capacity to understand and embrace the need for action and change. He also did something that few presidents have ever attempted. He used the presidency to bring out the best aspects of human nature. He once described his vision of America as follows: "If we can make our country one of the great schools of civilization, then on that achievement will surely rest our claim to the ultimate gratitude of mankind. I am certain that after the dust of centuries has passed over our cities, we will be remembered not for victories or defeats in battle or in politics, but for our contributions to the human spirit." To elevate the human spirit, Kennedy cultivated the interior aspects of our lives, the qualities that make us better people and thus better citizens. He challenged young people to join the Peace Corps, to begin their lives by leaving the comfort of their homes and traveling abroad to help the impoverished people of other nations. With this approach, Kennedy tapped into something science has long known. Human beings thrive when they are inspired and encouraged. Inspiration contains the kindness we all crave. It can lift people out of apathy and allow them to contribute to society. Unlike any president who followed him in office, Kennedy had the capacity and the will to build a responsive government. During his time in office, there was a bond between government and the people. In fact, government actually nurtured them on a personal level. This is the real meaning of Camelot, the term often used to describe the Kennedy years. Kennedy's death deprived the nation of this nurturing. Our presidents no longer speak about making America one of the great schools of civilization, nor do they seek to make us better citizens. A president who spoke in such terms today would draw blank stares from the people and ridicule from his opponents. In the years after Dallas, the nation was led by presidents who had little comprehension of the principles that Kennedy brought to the White House. Both Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon lied to the people. Johnson lied to escalate the war in Vietnam. Nixon, among other things, lied about the Watergate burglary in a desperate attempt to hang on to his presidency. They embedded in the nation's consciousness the demoralizing notion that presidents will do anything to get what they want or to protect themselves, and they trampled upon Kennedy's dictum that for this nation to flourish, our leaders must tell the truth. Damaged and disillusioned, America suffered through years of bitterness, a needless war, and the social conflict it caused. The people became cynical and uncertain about the honesty and objectives of their leaders. Without Kennedy to inspire them, they eventually succumbed to the complacency, the inertia of human thought that he had tried to prevent. Into this vacuum, in 1981, stepped a man who tragically reversed Kennedy's view of government. In the mind of Ronald Reagan, government was not a noble, time-tested system in which men like Jefferson and John Adams addressed the needs of the people with reason and intellect. Instead, he told the nation that government, because it collects taxes, spends money on the poor, regulates business, and is too large, is the enemy of the people and should be feared and distrusted. This is not the type of government Kennedy wanted for this country. In 1962, he warned the nation about the danger of allowing ideologues like Reagan to take control of government. He particularly feared the damage their rigid policies would inflict upon the economy. He said the nation's economic policy should never be determined by, in his words, some grand warfare of rival ideologies which will sweep the country with passion, but with the practical management of a modern economy. What we need are not labels and cliches, but more basic discussion of the sophisticated and technical questions involved in keeping a great economic machinery moving ahead. We have yet to confront the long-term consequences of losing John Kennedy. The harm inflicted on the nation by some of the men who came after him has gone largely unaddressed. Without much opposition, his successors have transformed the United States into a nation controlled by the wealthy, a plutocracy in which corporations are considered the equal of human beings. In the process, the political system bequeathed to us by the Founding Fathers has become secondary and dysfunctional. The purpose of this book is to discover how John Kennedy gained the wisdom to make America an enlightened nation. This knowledge perhaps will help give the people the courage to demand that we return to the type of responsible government the founders established and Kennedy brought to life. We begin with the events and experiences that made John Kennedy the man and the president that he was.